Speaker, before I begin, I'm sure the whole House will join me in sending our deepest condolences to the families and friends of James Furlong, Joe Ritchie Bennett and David Wales, who were brutally killed in Reading on Saturday. To assault defenceless people in a park is not simply an act of wickedness, but abject cowardice, and we will never yield to those who would seek to destroy our way of life. Mr. Speaker, with permission, I will update the House on the next steps in our plan to rebuild our economy and reopen our society while waging our struggle against COVID-19. From the outset, we have trusted in the common sense and perseverance of the British people, and their response has more than justified our faith. Since I set out our plan on the 11th of May, we have been clear that our cautious relaxation of the guidance is entirely conditional on our continued defeat of the virus. In the first half of May, nearly 69,000 people tested positive for COVID-19 across the UK. By the first half of June, that total had fallen by nearly 70% to just under 22,000. The number of new infections is now declining by between 2 and 4% every day. 4 weeks ago, an average of 1 in 400 people in the community in England had COVID-19. In the first half of June, this figure was 1 in 1,700. We created a human shield around the NHS, and in turn, our doctors and nurses have protected us. And together, we have saved our hospitals from being overwhelmed. On the 11th of May, 1,073 people were admitted to hospital in England, Wales and Northern Ireland with COVID-19. By the 20th of June, this had fallen by 74% to 283. This pandemic has inflicted permanent scars, and we mourn everyone we have lost. Measured by a 7-day rolling average, the number of daily deaths peaked at 943 on the 14th of April. On the 11th of May, it was 476, and yesterday, the rolling average stood at 130. We've ordered over 2.2 billion items of protective equipment from UK-based manufacturers, many of whose production lines have been called into being to serve this new demand. And yesterday we conducted or posted 139,659 tests, bringing the total to over 8 million. And while we remain vigilant, we do not believe there is currently a risk of a second peak of infections that might overwhelm the NHS. Taking everything together, we continue to meet our 5 tests, and the chief medical officers of all 4 home nations have downgraded the UK's COVID alert level from 4 to 3, meaning we no longer face a virus spreading exponentially, though it remains in general circulation. The administrations in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland hold responsibility for their own lockdown restrictions, and they will respond to the united view of the chief medical officers at their own pace, based on their own judgment. But all parts of the UK are now travelling in the same direction, and we will continue to work together to ensure that everyone in our country gets the support they need. Thanks to our progress, we can now go further and safely ease the lockdown in England. At every stage, caution will remain our watchword, and each step will be conditional and reversible. Mr. Speaker, given the significant fall in the prevalence of the virus, we can change the 2-metre social distancing rule from the 4th of July. I know this rule effectively makes life impossible for large parts of our economy, even without other restrictions. For example, it prevents all but a fraction of our hospitality industry from operating. That's why almost 2 weeks ago I asked our experts to conduct a review, and I will place a summary of their conclusions in the libraries of both houses this week. Where it is possible to keep 2 meters apart, people should. But where it is not, we will advise people to keep a social distance of 1 meter plus, meaning they should remain 1 meter apart while taking mitigations to reduce the risk of transmission. And we are today publishing guidance on how business can reduce the risk by taking certain steps to protect workers and customers. And these include, for instance, avoiding face-to-face seating by changing office layouts, reducing the number of people in enclosed spaces, improving ventilation, using protective screens and face coverings, closing non-essential social spaces, providing hand sanitizer, changing shift patterns so that staff work in set teams. And of course, we already mandate face coverings on public transport. While the experts cannot give a precise assessment of how much the risk is reduced, they judge these mitigations would make 1 meter plus broadly equivalent to the risk at 2 meters if those mitigations are fully implemented. So either will be acceptable and our guidance will change accordingly. And this vital change enables the next stage of our plan to ease the lockdown. And Mr. Speaker, I'm acutely conscious that people will ask legitimate questions about why certain activities are allowed and others are not. And I must ask the House to understand that the virus has no interest in these debates. Its only interest, its only ambition is to exploit any opportunities to recapture ground that we might carelessly vacate and to reinfect our communities. And so there is only one certainty: the fewer social contacts you have, the safer you will be. And my duty, our duty as the government, is to guide the British people, balancing our overriding aim of controlling the virus against our natural desire to bring back normal life. We cannot lift all the restrictions at once, so we have to make difficult judgments. And every step is scrupulously weighed against the evidence. Our principle is to trust the British public to use their common sense in the full knowledge of the risks, remembering that the more we open up, the more vigilant we will need to be. From now on, we will ask people to follow guidance on social contact instead of legislation. In that spirit, we advise that from the 4th of July, 2 households of any size should be able to meet in any setting inside or out. That does not mean they must always be the same 2 households. It will be possible, for instance, to meet one set of grandparents one weekend, the others the following weekend. But we are not recommending meetings of multiple households indoors because of the risks of creating greater chains of transmission. Outside, the guidance remains that people from several households can meet in groups of up to 6, and it follows that 2 households can also meet regardless of size. Mr. Speaker, I can tell the House that we will also reopen restaurants and pubs. Hallelujah! All hospitality indoors will be limited to table service, and our guidance will encourage minimal staff and customer contact. We will ask businesses to help NHS test and trace responds to any local outbreaks by collecting contact details from customers, as happens in other countries, and we will work with the sector to make this manageable. Almost as eagerly awaited as a pint will be a haircut, particularly by me, Mr. Speaker, and so we will reopen hairdressers with appropriate precautions, including the use of visors. We also intend to allow some other close contact services, such as nail bars, to reopen as soon as we can when we're confident they can operate in a COVID-secure way. From the 4th of July, provided that no more than 2 households stay together, people will be free to stay overnight in self-contained accommodation, including hotels and bed and breakfasts, as well as campsites, as long as shared facilities are kept clean. Most leisure facilities and tourist attractions will reopen if they can do so safely, including outdoor gyms and playgrounds, cinemas, museums, galleries, theme parks and arcades, as well as libraries, social clubs and community centres. Close proximity venues, such as nightclubs, soft play areas, indoor gyms, swimming pools and spas will, I'm afraid, need to remain closed for now, as will bowling alleys and water parks. But my right honourable friends, the Business and Culture Secretaries, will establish task forces with public health experts and these sectors to help them become COVID secure and reopen as soon as possible. We will also work with the arts industry on specific guidance to enable choirs, orchestras and theatres to resume live performances as soon as possible. Recreation and sport will be allowed, but indoor facilities, including changing rooms and courts, will remain closed, and people should only play close contact team sports with members of their household. Mr. Speaker, I know that many have mourned the closure of places of worship, and this year Easter, Passover and Eid all occurred during the lockdown. So I'm delighted that places of worship will be able to reopen for prayer and services, including weddings with a maximum of 30 people, all subject to social distancing. Meanwhile, our courts, probation services, police stations and other public services will increasingly resume face-to-face proceedings. Wraparound care for school-aged children and formal childcare will restart over the summer. Primary and secondary education will recommence in September with full attendance, and those children who can already go to school should do so because it is safe, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we will publish COVID-secure guidelines for every sector that is reopening, and slowly but surely these measures will restore a sense of normality. After the toughest restrictions in peacetime history, we are now able to make life easier for people to see more of their friends and families, and to help businesses get back on their feet and get people back into work. But the virus has not gone away. We will continue to monitor the data with the Joint Biosecurity Centre and our ever more effective test and trace system. And I must be clear to the House that, as we have seen in other countries, there will be flare-ups for which local measures will be needed. And we will not hesitate to apply the brakes and reintroduce restrictions, even at national level, if required. So I urge everyone to stay alert control the virus and save lives. Let's keep washing our hands, staying 2 metres apart wherever feasible, mitigating the risks at 1 metre where not, avoiding public transport where possible, wearing a mask when you have to use public transport, getting tested immediately if you have symptoms, self-isolating if instructed to do so by NHS Test and Trace. Today, we can say that our long national hibernation is beginning to come to an end, and life is returning to our streets and to our shops. The bustle is starting to come back, and a new but cautious optimism is palpable. But I must say to the House, it would be all too easy for that frost to return. And that is why we will continue to trust in the common sense and the community spirit of the British people to follow this guidance, to carry us through and to see us to victory over this virus. And I commend, Mr. Speaker, this statement to the House.
I now call the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Can I thank the Prime Minister for advance sight of his statement? And can I join the Prime Minister in sending our condolences to the families and friends of those who died and were injured in Reading on Saturday? This was a truly appalling attack. And I want to extend our thanks to the police officers and members of the public who showed incredible bravery in response. I spoke to my honourable friend for Reading East at the weekend, and I'm sure I speak for the whole House in saying to the people of Reading that we stand with them at this incredibly difficult time. Mr. Speaker, when I was elected leader of the Labour Party, I said I would offer constructive opposition with the courage to support the government where it is doing the right thing. We will, of course, scrutinise the details of this announcement. We will study the guidance, and there are obviously a number of questions that need to be answered. But overall, I welcome this statement. I believe the government is trying to do the right thing, and in that, we will support them. Mr. Speaker, there are no easy decisions to be made here. Any unlocking carries risks. It has to be phased, managed, and carefully planned. It needs to be based on scientific evidence, properly communicated, accompanied by robust track and trace systems, and there must be support for local councils and communities to respond quickly and decisively if there are any fresh outbreaks. But there are risks of inaction as well, of keeping businesses and schools closed, of keeping our economy closed, of keeping families apart, and we all need to recognise that today. I do have a number of questions about the basis for these decisions, which I hope the Prime Minister will address in a constructive way. First, the scientific evidence. I listened carefully to what he said about the 2 metre rule and the 1 metre rule. Can he assure the House that the package of measures is agreed by SAGE, the Chief Medical Officer and the Chief Scientific Officer? And what assessment has been made of the overall impact on transmission of the virus and on the R rate, both nationally and, of course, regionally? On the prevention of a second spike and reintroducing measures if needed, the Prime Minister knows local authorities will have to be central to that, but they need the resources and the powers. So what additional support is he providing to councils? And what new powers for swift local lockdown will be needed should there be a spike in infections? On protection of those working, particularly on the front line, we all want people to go back to work, but it has to be safe and standards have to be enforced. So what enforceable measures will the Prime Minister put in place to give confidence to those returning to work? And on support for businesses, these changes are necessary, but they will be complex, and many businesses have already spent thousands of pounds preparing to operate at 2 metres. These changes will be particularly felt by small businesses and on the high street. So what support can be given to them to address this? On the question of schools, I do think it's safe for some children to return to school, and I completely support that. The question is how quickly can we get all children back to school safely? The sooner, the better. It was the Education Secretary who told the House on the 9th of June that it would not be possible to bring all children back to school before the summer. And one of the reasons we support today's announcement is because it will make it more possible and easier to get children back to school quicker. We will support that. And my offer to work with the Prime Minister on this still stands. Mr. Speaker, finally on testing, track and trace, the Prime Minister will know that we've got very serious concerns about the gaps in the current system, including the absence of an app. Getting this right is essential to unlocking in a safe manner. And it's important the Prime Minister clarifies when the full track, trace and isolate system will be in place. Mr. Speaker, today is an important step in the fight against this virus. We will scrutinise the detail. We do want more clarity, but we welcome the thrust of this statement. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm very grateful to the right honourable gentleman for the spirit and the manner and the constructive way in which he has responded. And just on his points, may I just say that we do believe that all 5 tests have been met, as I said, and that means that the chief medical officer, the chief scientific advisor have been intimately involved in every stage of developing this programme, and they do believe that it is a programme that the step in our plan that allows us to go ahead whilst meeting that crucial test of not triggering a second wave. He asked about support for local councils, and I've said that we're putting in another 3.2 billion to support local councils, as well as 600 million to support their responsibilities for social care. But clearly, their responsibilities have not ended, and nor has our support ended. We will get this country through this crisis by doing everything it takes. And that takes me to his question about businesses. I don't think there's another country in the world that has done quite so much to support our workforce, to support our employees. The coronavirus job retention scheme, 11 million people supported, 2.6 million self-employed supported, 26 billion in bounce-back loans alone have been given out by this government, to say nothing of the huge support in grants. We're very confident that this is one of the most extraordinary packages to be provided by any government around the world, and we will continue to support our businesses. He mentions track and trace and isolate, and no country. Yes, of course, it's perfectly true that it would be great to have an app, but no country currently has a functioning track and trace app. And the great success of NHS Test and Trace, is that, contrary to some of the scepticism that we heard, alas, from the opposite benches, it has so far not only contacted 87,000 people who have been in contact with those who have coronavirus, but they have elected voluntarily to self-isolate and stop the disease from spreading in the community. And that is a fantastic success by our NHS Test and Trace operation. And we will continue to develop and improve that test and trace operation so as to crack down on local outbreaks and enable our country to go forward. And may I finally say how welcome it was, Mr. Speaker, to hear from the, there you are, Mr. Speaker, to hear from the right honourable gentleman that he actively supports children now returning to school, and that he believes that returning to school is safe. I think he said that. I don't want to accuse him of a U-turn, Mr. Speaker, but there is more joy in heaven over one sinner that repenteth, and so on. It's great. It's good to have his support on that matter today, and I welcome the spirit and the manner in which he has responded to this statement today.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With continuing relatively high rates of infection across Bedford Borough, I welcome the Prime Minister's balanced transition from over-reliance on regulation to greater reliance on the common sense of British businesses and employees. Will the Prime Minister now build on the exceptional programme of economic support provided to businesses with an ambitious acceleration of his levelling up programme, in particular drawing on the creativity and unlocking the creativity of our entrepreneurs, our small businesses and our innovators.
My honourable friend is absolutely on the money, on the point. He'll be hearing a lot more about exactly that, Mr. Speaker, in the course of the next couple of weeks, not only from me, but also from my honourable friend, the Chancellor.
We now go to Scotland with the leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford. Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I associate myself with the remarks of the Prime Minister and the leader of the Labour Party at the outrage that took place on Saturday in Reading? Our thoughts are very much with the family and friends of James Furlong, of Joe Ritchie Bennett and David Wales. And of course, we give grateful thanks to all our emergency services for the work that they continue to do. And on this day, perhaps, Mr. Speaker, if we can also just acknowledge the sad death of Harry Smith, the ex-political reporter for ITV and Scottish television, someone who will be sadly missed. Mr. Speaker, let me begin by thanking the Prime Minister for advance copy of his statement. Today's announcement will be understandably welcomed by many. But for every word of welcome, there must follow words of caution. The virus has not gone away. The margins for ensuring the virus does not take off again remain tight. Keeping people safe remains the first priority. We cannot put a price on human life. China and Germany are right now dealing with spikes in cases as a result of significant outbreaks. Health officials in South Korea have said they think the country is now experiencing a second wave. A similar experience here would amount to not just a health disaster, but an economic disaster. It would wipe out all the hard-won progress, all the self-sacrifice over recent months. It is vital that our collective efforts remain focused on preventing the disaster of a second spike. We must remain cautious too, because the public are now well used to hearing grand announcements from this Prime Minister, only for a U-turn to follow days or weeks later. Not only has this UK government wasted precious time on introducing a botched test and trace system, but they've wasted millions of taxpayers' money in the process too. Mr. Speaker, that is why it is essential that the next steps are solely directed by the science rather than by political pressures. So can the Prime Minister confirm that he will publish not just the conclusions, but the full review on social distancing measures and the scientific advice given? We know that a review of quarantining measures following foreign travel is due next week. Will the Prime Minister confirm that the introduction of any air bridges will be based on public health assessments, not economic assessments? And can he also confirm that the devolved governments will be closely involved and party to any arrangements with any country on air bridges? And finally, Mr. Speaker, to maintain full clarity, will the Prime Minister reaffirm that the announcements that he is making today are solely for England, and that the citizens of Northern Ireland, of Wales and Scotland should continue to follow public health advice from their own governments?
Mr. Speaker, indeed, well, on that last point, of course, I can confirm that, as indeed I said in my statement, though I observe that the harmony between all four home nations is, in fact, much closer than you might sometimes believe from listening to the right honourable gentleman. But I agreed, I must say, with a great deal of what he had to say, because he's right, Mr. Speaker, to express the caution that he does. He's right to anticipate the risk of second spikes. And that is, and I'm afraid that we will see future outbreaks. And I must be absolutely clear with the House about that. We will see future outbreaks, and we will be in a much better position now to control those outbreaks. I will, of course, publish the measures on social distancing, how the decision was reached on social distancing. I said we'll place that in both libraries of the House. And Mr. Speaker, he had one more question, which I'm afraid I can't remember. What was it about public health? I can't remember. I will write to the. I will air bridges. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Sorry, air bridges. He asked an important question about air bridges and we will ensure that, of course, the devolved administrations are kept in close contact as we develop our plans, and they will be based, our plans for quarantine will be based, of course, entirely, as he rightly suggests, on public health. That will be our criterion, and we will not be led by any excessive desire to risk public life, risk life by opening up the economy too fast. We will have a policy on air bridges that is based on public health, as he rightly says.
Bill Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I very much welcome the changes my right honourable friend has just announced on the 2-metre rule, which is great news for pubs and restaurants such as the Moat House in Staffordshire Bill, that are at the heart of the community in Staffordshire. But can he give me assurances that as we move to 1 metre plus, that it will be safe for us to trust in the common sense of the British people to reduce transmission? And can I take this opportunity to invite the Prime Minister to have a pint in my constituency?
Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend, and I'm very happy to take up her invitation. Thank you.
David.
Can I join the Prime Minister in sending our condolences to the family and friends of the appalling attacks in Reading? Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister wants to reassure us that the lockdown can be safely eased, while rightly warning that there is a danger of a second wave of coronavirus later this year. If he's right, though, and there's a breathing space now, surely it's urgent that we learn the lessons. So can I ask the Prime Minister again, will he urgently set up an independent inquiry into the government's handling of this pandemic?
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure there will come a moment when lessons need to be learned. We're learning them indeed the whole time, but I do not consider at the moment that a full-scale national inquiry is a good use of official time.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. I warmly welcome the Prime Minister's statement, which reflects very closely the advice that my select committee has taken. The Prime Minister has a new advisory group, and I'm glad of it, because the best role for SAGE is on broad questions of science rather than every little minute policy. But can he now specify from his statement whether the ban on cricket has come to an end? Cricket is perhaps our most socially distanced team sport. We've lost half the summer, but there is another half left to be enjoyed by players and spectators alike.
Mr. Speaker, I'm really grateful to my right honourable friend, and this goes to the point that I was trying to make to the House earlier, because everybody will want to add something on to the great wheelbarrow of measures that we're making, and at a certain point there will come a straw that breaks the camel's back. The problem with cricket is everybody understands that the ball is a natural vector of disease, potentially at any rate, and we've been round it many times with our scientific friends. At the moment, we're still working on ways to make cricket more COVID secure, but we can't change the guidance yet.
Jeffrey Donalds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could I echo the comments in relation to the victims of the terrible atrocity in Reading, and our thoughts are with their families. I also support the Prime Minister's contention that the need for a four-nation approach is very important. And in that context, will the Prime Minister commit to share the rationale, data, scientific evidence and advice upon which these decisions are based with the Northern Ireland Executive, with our Chief Medical Officer and Chief Scientific Advisor, to ensure that we continue to have this coordinated approach going forward?
Mr. Speaker, as I've informed the House, the four CMOs, Chief Medical Officers of all former home nations, were unanimous in their view that the alert level should go down from 4 to 3, and we will continue to work together as we have and to share information as we go forward.
Sir Brittle.
Mr. Speaker, this news will be a relief for so many pub owners in Harnburn and Haslingden, whether that be the Green Squirrel or the Hayes. And the relaxation of the 2-metre rule will make it that little bit easier for micropubs, such as the Vault, Hustle Bar and the Nusden Tap. But can the Prime Minister assure me that the government will work closely with local authorities so that pubs and restaurants may be able to utilise their outdoor space and will he visit Hand and Hazard?
I will, Mr. Speaker. There's hardly any area of the country that I don't intend to visit in the course of the reopening of the pubs and hostelries of this country. And I think there's a massive opportunity now for our pubs, with all their inventiveness, to think of ways of making their businesses COVID secure, exploiting outdoor spaces, hitherto unloved, valued outdoor spaces that may become havens for tables and chairs. That's right, and to use their ingenuity to open up in all the ways that they can.
We now come to Liv Saville-Roberts.
People crave confidence and competence, Mr. Speaker. With England's so-called well-beating app scrapped before it even launched, contact tracers unable to reach a third of positive cases, and no financial support, no financial scheme to support workers when public health requires them to self-isolate. What assessment has he made of the risks to business and public confidence if local lockdowns or a second peak prove beyond his government's ability to manage?
Mr. Speaker, the Right Honourable Lady knows very, very well that this government has invested record sums in protecting business. By comparison, any other country, we've done more to protect businesses around the whole of the country, including in Wales. I may say that I said that we're proceeding as one UK, and we are. I have my doubts, Mr. Speaker, I must say, about the 5-mile rule in Wales, and wonder whether that might be something that was reviewed. But she makes a very important point about the need to protect against a second outbreak and to make sure that we are in good shape to crack down on flare-ups. And I believe we are, and I believe to an extent that perhaps we didn't think possible a month ago. We are able to do local whack-a-mole in the way that she describes.
Brave.
Mr. Speaker, can I congratulate my right honourable friend? This announcement, particularly the reductions of the distancing rule, itself will save hundreds of thousands of jobs. So he's already done a good day's work today. Can I ask him to ensure the practicality of future guidance? Complex rules about who can do what and where and when they can do it may seem rational when discussed around a table in Whitehall, but if they're too complex and too unclear, people won't obey them. So can he make sure that the rules for the future are as clear and simple and understandable as possible?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is entirely right. The difficulty, a message like stay at home, protect the NHS, it's very simple. Everybody can see what they have to do. Getting into the easing of the lockdown is much more complex, but I think that the guidance we've set out today is intelligible. I think people will understand what they need to do. The British people have shown massive common sense so far. I'm sure they're going to continue to do so.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. Last week in my constituency in Cleckheaton, we had a COVID-19 outbreak in a meat processing factory. Kirklees Council acted swiftly and efficiently. My concern is with the government's easing of lockdown, we will see these localised outbreaks, and with the Health and Safety Executive having their budget cut by 50% since 2010, can the government ensure that Kirklees and other councils will have all the money they need to keep our communities safe? And also, what investigations are going ahead from government to look at why meat processing particularly is exposed to COVID-19 outbreaks, not just here and in this country and around the world, so we can keep those members of staff safe?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we're certainly looking into what's happening to meat processing, and she's right to draw attention to that phenomenon. We've seen it in Anglesey, we've seen it in Germany. We need to get to the bottom of what is happening. We're putting more into health and safety executive, as she knows. Another £14 million we're giving to bolster our health and safety executive. And local councils will be fortified in implementing local lockdowns by central government, by the Joint Biosecurity Centre, so that we are able to crack down very, very efficiently on these flare-ups as they happen.
Mr. Speaker, going to the pub is a great British institution and vital if we want to get our economy back on track. Will the Prime Minister therefore join me in calling on people from the 4th of July to do their patriotic best for Britain and go to the pub?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I do encourage people to take advantage of the freedoms that they are rightly reacquiring, but I must stress that people should act in a responsible way, and I know that that is where the public are. I know that that is what people want to see. They want to see this reopening happening gradually. They want to see the frost leaving the tundra slowly. They understand the risks that we still face. And so, yes, I want to see people out in the shops. It's a fantastic thing to see. Yes, I want to see people taking advantage of hospitality. Again, a wonderful thing. Yes, I want to see people enjoying friends and family. Again, but they've got to do it in a responsible way and observing social distancing.
Going to Scotland with Ronnie Cowan. Ronnie Cowan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As we attempt to move people back into the workplace, the job retention scheme is being abused by some companies to make employees redundant before August, when employers would have to pay a percentage of their salary. Moreover, others like British Airways are threatening to fire tens of thousands of loyal workers and rehire them, some on slashed pay and poorer conditions. Prime Minister, you said you were looking at what we can do. So you back my colleague, the member for Paisley and North Renfrewshire, whose dismissal and unemployment fire and rehire bill addresses this iniquity.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I will of course study the bill to which the honourable gentleman alludes, but I will study it. I will cause it to be studied. Mr. Speaker, I can tell him that he knows very well that this country has given unprecedented and unequalled support to workers and to businesses. I think 1 million companies have taken advantage of the job retention scheme. 1 million companies, 2.6 million self-employed people. There's nothing like it around the world. I think we should be very proud of what the UK has done, and we will continue to ensure that no one is penalised for doing the right thing to beat this virus.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As my right honourable friend has said, the primary aim of policy was to stop the NHS being swamped, and that was met, which is a great achievement. But will he take the opportunity today to restate that in the absence of a vaccine or a cure, this virus will stay in circulation, and what people refer to as a second wave is in fact a continuation of the first wave. It has not gone away. And we can expect flare-ups as we have in Germany. And while the measures today are welcome, which incidentally give a whole new meaning to safe drinking, their observation will be vital if we're to avoid a widespread second lockdown, which would be an economic and social disaster for the country.
Prime Minister.
That's absolutely right, Mr. Speaker. I think there have been two important changes in our arsenal in the last 6 weeks or so. The first has obviously been NHS test and trace, which is getting better the whole time and is invaluable in fighting the disease. But the second is the treatments. And dexamethasone, which was tested in this country, really does make a big difference to the mortality of the disease. And I've no doubt that other progress will be made. He's right to be, I think, reserved about the possibilities of getting a full vaccine. That is going to be very difficult. But in the meantime, we will have to remain extremely vigilant and extremely cautious.
We're going to Belfast South with Claire Hanna. Claire Hanna.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Prime Minister, today, despite a strong test and trace regime, a region in Germany had to impose a specific lockdown on several 100,000 people due to a dangerously high R number. And we know that, unfortunately, while we're progressing, we're only at the end of the beginning of our restrictions. You're right to say that the job retention and self-employed scheme have been vital to many people. And I want to ask, what contingency do you have in place for ad hoc localised lockdowns that may be required? And will you roll out localised versions of job retention schemes for those areas?
Mr. Speaker, I thank the Honourable Leader. Let's really repeat my last answer. We don't want to see anybody penalised for doing the right thing.
16 withdrawn. Daniel Zachner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There are approximately 1 million 16 to 18-year-olds in England and some 700,000 study in colleges. Astonishingly, this week's education catch-up plan omitted those colleges, including many in my constituency of Cambridge. Can the Prime Minister explain the government's thinking behind this, and will he sort it out?
Mr. Speaker, we will, of course, do everything we can to ensure that not just our schools, but also our colleges get the attention that they need. As he knows, there is massive investment now going into the rebuilding of FE colleges and to ensuring that our college, FE sector gets the investment it deserves.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I warmly welcome the news from the Prime Minister regarding the tourism sector, which will be especially well received in East Devon, and of course he's more than welcome to visit any time. Can the Prime Minister confirm the government will publish full guidance to ensure businesses can keep themselves and their customers safe whilst keeping the virus under control?
Yes, indeed, Mr. Speaker, and the guidance, as I say, will be published later on today.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister has highlighted examples around the world where restrictions have been relaxed and where there has been a subsequent resurgence of the virus, and he has said that he will not hesitate to reintroduce restrictions if required. I would just like to get an unambiguous commitment from him in terms of not seeing anyone penalised for doing the right thing to combat this virus. If it is necessary to continue with the furlough and self-employment support schemes beyond October, will his government do so?
Mr. Speaker, we've said what we've said about the furloughing scheme. It's our intention, obviously, to make sure that we're not in a situation where we have to keep those national schemes going. That's why the furlough scheme is tapering off in October. But clearly, if there are I've said what I've said, if there are localised outbreaks, or indeed if it is nationally necessary to put the brakes back on, then nobody should be penalised for doing the right thing.
Andrew Letson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the last few weeks, we've seen a real outpouring of love and kindness across our communities, across the country, for our older citizens. And that's quite right. But we haven't seen the same thing for our youngest citizens. So can the Prime Minister tell me what the government is doing for those who have had a baby during lockdown, or indeed who are struggling to cope, as he might be, with the challenge of having a new baby and with so little face-to-face support?
Thank you. Well, I'm grateful to my right honourable friend. I'm personally coping fine, thank you. But well, thank you. But what we are doing, as you will have heard in my statement, is where wraparound childcare is coming back for the summer. And as she knows, early years is open, reception is open, and wouldn't it be a fine thing to hear from the party opposite that it's safe for all the young kids to go back?
Heading to South London with Vicky Foxcroft. Vicky Foxcroft.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This morning, I met with Disability Rights UK, who are worried that support for shielded people is being removed too quickly. In their words, if government can be sensitive to business until October, why can't they be sensitive to personal needs? Now, throughout this crisis, communication with shielded and disabled people has been poor. Will he commit to working closely with these groups to ensure clearer, more regular communication as we move out of lockdown and towards planning for a second wave?
Well, yes, Mr. Speaker, she raises a very important point. In fact, we've extended the shielding programme, as you know, Mr. Speaker, till the end of July. 3 million food parcels have already been delivered to shielded people. What we want to see is a situation in which the prevalence, the incidence is so low that the shielding programme no longer needs to continue in its current way. And I think that should be a shared ambition around the House and around the country. Too many elderly, vulnerable people have been kept in close confinement for too long, and we must help them to a new way out.
Richard Graham.
Mr. Speaker, this statement paves the way for Britain to bounce back, with most of the hospitality sector reopening, and gives us more confidence for the 10th anniversary of the Gloucester History Festival in September. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that while many of us want to see cricket played again safely, air bridges established as soon as possible, the absolutely crucial goal is for all children and pupils and students at FE colleges and universities to be able to go back to school, college and university in the autumn absolutely safely?
Absolutely, Mr. Speaker, and a point I perhaps could have made to the right honourable, the honourable gentleman who's I think no longer in his seat. It is our intention to get not just schools but FE colleges back as well in September, and get our young people back where they need to be in education and preparing for their future.
Anna McMorran.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It seems the Prime Minister has given up working with all four nations. COBRA hasn't met for weeks, and daily communications have ended. And I'm pretty sure the First Minister for Wales has forgotten what the Prime Minister even looks like. Does he not believe that his actions are leading to a disjointed rather than united union? And given recent data suggests that the people of Wales have far more confidence in the Welsh Government's handling of this pandemic than the people of England do in his, should he not perhaps be following the strategy championed by the Labour government of Wales?
Mr. Speaker, I make no comment on the blessed amnesia that has descended on the First Minister of Wales, except to say that actually, when you look at the facts, when you look at what the UK is doing together, we are in much closer harmony than you would suspect from what she says. Perhaps one detail, one wrinkle to which I respectfully draw her attention is I'm not sure the 5-mile limit rule is entirely necessary, and perhaps that needs to be rethought.
Where 25 is withdrawn, so we're going down to Sir Gary Streeter. Sir Gary Streeter.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank my right honourable friend for the clarity he has given to the hospitality and tourism sector in the Great South West today? But can he also give a glimmer of hope that the government will look sympathetically at more support over the winter, if necessary, to ensure that this very seasonal sector can survive such a restricted season? Thank you.
Prime Minister.
Yes, indeed, Mr. Speaker. Though, as my right honourable friend already knows, we're doing a massive amount to support businesses of all kinds, particularly through getting rid of business rates for the whole of next year. But one thing I would say respectfully to all those who represent tourist areas of this country, now is the time perhaps to send out a welcoming signal to those from other parts of our country, and to roll out the welcome mat rather than the not welcome here sign. Something we could do together.